I don't want to hurt you. You're not hurting me. She framed his face between her hands. I should get cleaned up first. Later, she murmured. We have so little time. Cidra, do you know what it does to me when you look at me like that? Like what? As if you want me so much, you'll dissolve if you don't get me. I might. His fingers were trembling as he undid the delicate fastenings of the yellow gold robe. It slid to the floor, a heap of treasure around her feet. Severance decided it was nothing compared to the treasure it had concealed. He unhooked the utility belt and draped it on the table beside the bed. Impatiently, he tugged off the rest of his clothing. When he was finished, he reached out to touch Cidra. It occurred to him again that he should get under a hot spray before he claimed such a sweet-smelling woman, but he couldn't seem to stop himself. Already he was pushing her backward onto the bed. Watch out for Fred, Cidra said. Where is he? I don't know. He's usually in here somewhere. Severance looked up and saw 3 rows of teeth grinning at him from the window ledge above the bed. Hello, Fred. Go back to sleep. The 3 rows of teeth winked out of sight. Severance gathered Cidra into his arms. He heard her soft sigh, felt the warm, eager welcome in her arms, and wondered how he could let her go in the morning. Then he stopped thinking of the future entirely. All that existed for him was the present with its promise of passion and satisfaction. On Renaissance, a man took what he could get. He made love to Cidra with the burning need of a man who knows he's going to go hungry for a long time. Severance didn't know what brought him up out of sleep later that night. He came awake the way he usually did on Renaissance, with a sudden alertness that kicked his system into full gear. He lay listening to the shadows, unmoving. One arm was wrapped securely around Cidra, as if even in his sleep he were afraid of losing her. Her rounded rear was nestled intimately into his thighs, and he could feel the curves of her ******** under his palm, but it hadn't been Cidra who had awakened him. She was sound asleep. He listened intently, and then he heard a faint movement on the window ledge. Fred was awake too. Perhaps he had only heard the sound of his movement. The rain had begun, pouring down outside with enough force and noise to mask any sounds from the street. Severance wondered if it had been Disma's return to the house that had brought him up out of sleep. But he could hear nothing from the hall. Then he heard another sound, and this time he recognized it, the hiss of a deflector screen as a man moved through it. The faint noise was coming from the deflector that guarded the window across the room. Severance slitted his eyes and turned his head a few fractions of a centimeter. A shadow moved on the other side of the diazite pane. On the window ledge over the bed, Fred shifted again. Severance reached up and touched the rock rug. Fred went still, his body still and alert. Satisfied that the creature was going to obey the silent command, Severance reached for the knife in his utility belt. Logically, whoever was outside the window shouldn't be able to open it. The diazite was locked. But there were ways around locks. Too many ways. Severance wasn't very surprised when the diazite pane swung inward without a sound. The figure coming through the window was holding a pulsar. He got no more man, one leg hooked over the windowsill. Severance came to a sitting position in a smooth rush of movement, launching the knife in his hand with the full power of his shoulder and upper arm. The heavy-duty utility knife caught the intruder in the right side of his chest. The pulsar dropped to the floor as the victim yelled in pain and rage. The force of the blow sent him spinning backward, out of the window and onto the ground. Severance. Cidra came awake with a startled gasp, clutching at the sheet. Rain was pouring through the open window. What happened? What's wrong? But he was already out of bed and leaning out of the window. An instant later he was through it and crouching on the ground outside. Cidra heard Fred moving agitatedly on the ledge above her, and then she felt him undulating down onto her shoulder and along the bed. He was moving almost as fast as Severance had moved. The rock rug crossed the room and wriggled onto the other window ledge. Cidra wasn't far behind both of them. Severance? What are you? Sweet Harmony, it's him. She stared at the man lying flat on the ground in the pouring rain. Severance was hunkered down beside him, his nude body gleaming sleekly from the steady downpour. "It's him," she said again, dazed. "The man who attacked Disma and me in the lab." Then she saw the blood mingling with the rainwater that was running down the man's chest. The hilt of the utility knife protruded from his rumpled clothing. She caught her breath. Is he dead? No. My aim was a little off. It's hard to get an accurate shot from a sitting position, especially when you're in a hurry. Severance was examining his victim. "You're sure it's the same renegade?" She stared at the stricken man, whose face was twisted in a grimace of pain. It was an expression that wasn't all that different from the one of fear she had last seen him wearing. "It's him. What's he doing here?" Everyone assumed he'd disappeared. Since he's still alive, we'll be able to ask him a whole lot of interesting questions. See if Disma is home yet. If not, use her compphone to get company security out here. Cidra hesitated, deeply aware of the pain the intruder must be feeling. "We've got to stop the bleeding, Severance." He looked up at her as she stood framed in the window. For the first time Cidra saw the expression on his face. Rain washed over his hard features, revealing a grim, hollow stare that shook her to the core. "I'm almost sure he came through that window to kill you," Severance said much too softly. "I don't give a damn if he dies right here and now. Go wake Disma." She still had far to go yet before she became completely accustomed to wolf ways, Cidra thought as she went in search of Disma. There was no sense fooling herself. In some respects she would never become a true wolf. She wondered if it was that weakness in her nature that made Severance wary of taking her with him. Severance watched the window as Cidra disappeared and wondered if she could ever accept the part of him that was capable of this kind of violence. Then he looked down at the man on the ground and felt like slitting the renegade's throat. The temptation to finish the job he'd begun with the utility knife was strong. Not only had the intruder represented a threat to Cidra, he had given her one more glimpse of Severance as a man who was about as far from being a harmonic as it was possible to get. Cidra stood in the departure lounge the next day waiting for Severance to confirm her reservation. She was wearing her embroidered green midday robe, and her hair was in its usual coronet. Her hands were clasped in front of her in the formal position of patience. Around her the hustle of passengers and crew flowed unheeded, not touching her either physically or emotionally. She felt isolated and intensely alone, her eyes following Severance as he verified her flight. As he turned to make his way back through the crowd she searched his face, hoping for some sign of a reprieve. There was none. Severance had made up his mind, and she knew better than to expect to change it at this late hour. Cidra felt a rush of anger and resentment at the midnight intruder, not because he had come through the window with the intention of killing her so Matt she couldn't identify him, but because he had succeeded in ruining what was left of her last night with Severance. The man had been questioned by company security immediately after he had received medical aid for the knife wound. Then Severance and Cidra had both been obliged to give statements. It was all cut and dried as far as the legal aspects went. Violence within Try Again was dealt with severely. Renaissance couldn't afford to encourage it inside the one safe zone on the planet. Bad for business. The intruder was under computer lock, but no one could give Cidra back the rest of her night with Severance. Morning had arrived all too quickly. You're all set. I upgraded your cabin. This way you'll have more room. She inclined her head in formal thanks. Bigger laugh too, he added in a deadpan tone. You can bathe to your heart's content. You'll be able to spend the whole trip under a spray if you feel like it. It was very thoughtful of you. I am in your debt. Severance winced. Could you cut out the ritualistic good manners? Sometimes lately I've had the feeling that you use them when you want to be sarcastic. I'm never sure how to take them. I'm sorry, Severance, she whispered unhappily. Nothing was going right. Severance had been short-tempered with her since he had used his knife against the man who had tried to kill her. Time was running out, and they seemed to have less and less to say to each other. Cidra was aware of a sensation of panic waiting to swamp her. Severance ignored her soft apology, took her arm, and guided her over to a quieter section of the lounge. "I've got something I want you to do for me." Cidra's heart lifted for the first time that morning. "Of course," she said simply, but her eyes were shining. He handed her a credit plate. "Take it." She stared at it in dismay. "But it's for your account. I've had it opened for you. You can use that card to access it." "But, Severance, I don't need any credit. I have plenty of my own, remember? What is this all about? I don't understand." "If this is some gesture of warped responsibility on your part, you can just forget it. I don't want your share of the stake." "Cidra, try not to get hysterical on me over a little thing like this. I am not exactly giving you the entire contents of my credit account." "Then what are you giving me?" "Access to it. I'm going to be stuck on board severance pay for the next several weeks. On board, communications are limited. You know that. I don't have the facilities to do research or make investments from the deck of a mail ship. On the other hand, you're going to be running around Clementia with access to the best information sources on 3 planets. I don't want my 250,000 sitting still in a credit account. I want it working. You want me to invest it for you? Something short-term and highly profitable," he said bluntly. "You're the one with all the education. Do something useful with it and with my stake. Take good care of it, Cidra. Lose my capital for me and I know," she said. "You'll take it out of my hide." She was gazing up at him with a palpable glow as she clutched the credit slip tightly in her palm. "I'll take care of your stake for you, Severance. I swear it." He smiled crookedly. "I know you will. I trust you." Not with his heart and not yet with his future, but he trusted her with his credit. It was a hopeful sign, and Cidra clung to it. She dropped the credit slip carefully into the concealed pocket of her robe. It was a bond between herself and Severance, one that would surely draw him back for no other reason than to find out what she had done with his capital. Any kind of dust at all from a wolf like Severance was a small miracle. "You will be very careful, Severance?" "I'll be careful." He touched the tip of her ear. "You'll go straight home to Clementia and stay out of second-class taverns and dives?" "I promise." "Cidra," he broke off as if uncertain about what to say next. Cidra touched his hand. "It's all right, Severance. I understand. It has to be Ms. Way. This is the only way you can be sure of yourself and of me." She stood on tiptoe and kissed him lightly. Then she stepped back. "I'll be waiting for you." She turned and was gone. Severance felt his gut twist as she walked into the crowd of departing passengers. Her slender, green-robed figure was lost amid the hulking uniforms and standard-issue Renaissance jungle garb. For an instant he almost gave into the sense of panic that was clawing at his insides. She was out of reach already. The panel doors of the boarding gate were sealing shut, cutting her off from him, perhaps forever. He'd been a fool. He should have taken his chances, should have risked the odds and kept her with him. He'd taken so many risks in his life, why hadn't he been able to take this one? But he had no right to try to make up her mind for her. She needed time and the peace of Clementia. Only then could she be sure of what she was doing. Severance reached into a small pouch on his utility belt and let Biss' fingers close around the fire-burrow comb. The feel of it seemed to soothe the gnawing uncertainty that he knew was going to be a close companion during the long weeks ahead. Chapter 20 QED looked different on this trip, Severance realized as he oversaw the unloading of the mail. The endless vistas of orange and red dust were as barren and forbidding as ever, but the sight of them no longer made his stomach tighten or caused his mind to beat at him in angry frustration. Revenge was exactly what he had always suspected it would be, calming and satisfying. It hadn't taken away the old pain or allowed him to forget his own sense of responsibility for what had happened to Judd, but it had quieted him inside. The pain and the feeling of being partially responsible were things he had already learned to live with during the past 2 years. Time diluted the self-recriminations and would continue to do so. But exacting a measure of justice had eased him inside in a way that time would never have succeeded in doing. Racer's death had paid not only for the threats to Cidra but also for Jude's death, and it had balanced some internal scale. Qed was never going to be his idea of the ideal vacation spot of the Stanza 9 system. The planet would always hold memories of the deaths of his parents and his brother. But Severance could view the raw, boomtown of Proof and the outlying Orange Hills with a sense of perspective now. It occurred to him that it wasn't simply revenge that had enabled him to gain perspective. He had learned something from Cidra too. Her gentleness had also eased something inside him. This was an ore and mineral-rich land. Companies and individuals were wresting fortunes out of the ground with the assistance of the ubiquitous spider sleds. Severance was obliged to step out of the way of one of the mobile metal monsters as he crossed the landing field to the port office. Its long, insect-like legs, so useful for covering rough terrain, narrowly missed his boot. "Hey, up there," he yelled to the man in the driver's seat, "if you can't operate that thing properly, someone's going to show you how it's done the hard way." "Don't need any advice on how to do it the hard way," the middle-aged ex-miner rasped. "I do it that way all the time." "Back again, huh, Severance? Miss the local fun spots?" "The only thing I've missed is taking your loose credit in a game of free market, Tanner." Severance stopped beside the spider's lead as the man halted it. "You interested in trying to take back some of what you lost last time I was in port?" "Sure, if we can use my cubes." Tanner grinned hugely, his weathered face crinkling into 100 creases. "The day I let you use your cubes is the day I'll be too spaced to play." "Don't trust anyone, do you, Severance?" Tanner observed with mock admiration. Severance thought about it. At one time his answer would have been a ready no. "Maybe one woman I know." "Severance, you're a damn fool if the one person you decide to trust is female. I do believe you've got a problem." "I'm coping. See you this evening. And I'll bring the cubes." He moved away from the spider's lead as it lurched into motion. One night was all he would be spending on QED this trip. Severance no longer cared if he missed a few mail contracts by rushing back off planet. He didn't care that he would be turning around to face another 6 weeks of empty space without more than a one-night's break. All he cared about was starting the journey back to Lovelady. The 6 weeks from Renaissance had been the longest and loneliest of his life, even worse than the dark season after Jude's death. At least during that period he'd had his own bitterness and self-reproach to keep him company. But for the past 6 weeks, the only company he'd had aside from Fred had been memories of Cidra. The ship had seemed deserted without her. It had amazed Severance at first. He was accustomed to being alone on board with only Fred as a companion. He shouldn't have been so shocked to find himself alone again, but he was. He would wake up in the morning longing for the smell of hot coffee and someone to share it with. He would stand under the spray in the lave, and his mind would be filled with images of Cidra's charming tendency to waste water. She was so scrupulously clean and sweet-smelling, he missed other things too. She'd had the ability to share time with him without demanding that he entertain her. Cidra was a woman with whom he could be quiet. For hours at a time she had retreated to her bunk to read or become absorbed in her programming while he worked out on the exercise machine or fiddled with a gadget. But he had always been pleasantly conscious of her presence, a satisfying sensation. She had become a companion, not just a passenger. She had withstood his temper too. Severance knew he had been abrupt with her on more than one occasion. But she'd handled it without sulking or crying. Most of all he missed having her in his arms. The memories of her sweet, hot warmth had plagued him every league of the way from Renaissance, and Severance knew he would be goaded by them every league of the trip back. There had been other thoughts that had eaten at him too. He'd found himself picturing her at home in Clementia, surrounded by the serenity and ritual in which she had been raised, but a part of him had begun to insist that his Cidra could never be truly happy in Clementia. When all was said and done, she was no harmonic. Her passion, her spirit, and her strength would forever bar her from her world just as surely as her lack of telepathy. Cidra wasn't fated to be happy in Clementia, then he had a right to take her with him. That knowledge had been growing steadily since he had put her on the freighter back to Lovelady. He had a right to take her, Severance decided, because she belonged to him now. She would always belong to him. If she didn't yet realize that, then he would have to make her understand. The restless desire to be on his way back to claim his woman made Severance lengthen his stride toward the port offices. The sooner he completed his business on QED, the better. The most important thing in his life was waiting. You'll go with him when he comes for you, won't you, Cidra? Talina Peastree smiled gently at her daughter, who sat across her from on a white stone bench. The bench had been hand-carved by an expert craftsman who had worked the hard substance into a light and balanced piece of sculpture. It had cost a great deal of credit, but Talina and her husband, Garn, could afford it. The garden in which the stone bench resided was even more expensive. It was shaded with a unique variety of graceful paula trees that had been cultivated to order. Formal swirls of flowering plants added color and scent to the perfectly designed scene. All was serene. If he comes for me, I'll go with him. Cidra finished the last step of the highly ritualized ceremony that preceded the serving of ether wine and handed her mother a crystal goblet full of the golden liquid. Her green eyes met those of her mother. I will be going away even if he doesn't come for me. Talina nodded with an air of quiet acceptance. I know. I have always known that one day you would leave. But remember that Clementia will always be here for you when you wish to return for a while. I would never cut myself off from my home. Even though I am not a true harmonic, the way is a part of me. It is a part of all humans, Talina said. Cidra's mouth curved in amusement. That's what Severance once said. Your Severance sounds perceptive. He's also occasionally rude, arrogant, and obnoxious. He's a wolf. Talina's hand moved gracefully in her lap. She was wearing one of her exquisite early afternoon gowns, a cream-colored robe embroidered with silver floss. Her silvered hair was bound in the same regal coronet that Cidra wore. She had bequeathed many of her features to her daughter, but in Talina those features were overlaid with an internal serenity that Cidra could only approximate. I am also a wolf. Talina watched her daughter as she made the quiet declaration. It is not difficult for you to accept that now? Know then your adventures on Renaissance have indeed been worthwhile. You have learned much. I have learned to accept myself for what I am. But the most interesting part is that even if I were offered a clear choice now, I would not choose to become a harmonic. I don't think I could bear to give up what I have found waiting inside myself. Then you will be content with your future. I am glad for you, my daughter. Most glad. She sipped the wine and then turned her elegant head as her husband stepped into the garden from his study. Ah, Garn. Will you join us for a glass of wine? With pleasure. Garn came forward to sit beside his wife. His clear blue eyes were full of intelligence as he regarded Cidra. Garnoquist wore the shorter, masculine version of the early afternoon surplice, a deep brown robe belted with a knotted thang of multicolored braided floss. His handsome face with its strong nose and high forehead held the same air of inner serenity that his wife's wore. When Garn took his seat beside his wife, Cidra sensed the brief, silent mental communion that took place between her parents. It was a quiet touching of minds that Cidra had once envied with all her heart. Once that subtle communication had made her feel left out and deprived. But today she found she was accepting it for what it was, a harmonic way that she could not follow. She had other methods of communication open to her. They might be less certain, more vulnerable to risk, but when they worked well. She was satisfied with them now. They held their own rewards. What are the two of you discussing? Her father asked. My future, Cidra said with a smile. But the truth is that I've got something far more immediate and important to discuss with you, Father. I need advice in one of your areas of expertise. Which one? Garn sampled his wine with judicious care. He had many areas of expertise, some of which had made him rich, the theoretical aspects of the credit system. I never realized you had an interest in the financial system. I never had enough credit to make it worth worrying about. Cidra's smile broadened into a small grin. But now you do. Yes, she said. Now I do. I want to invest, father, the full 500,000. Her father had been considering his daughter's fortune ever since he learned of it. Now he spoke his mind. Whoever negotiated the sale of your discoveries did an excellent job. I know. But now it's my turn. I'm in charge of investing the credit. Something high yield and relatively short term. Garn reflected seriously for a long moment and men nodded. There are some young and aggressive exploration firms that offer excellent prospects. According to my information, they are presently seeking capital investment. One in particular, a firm called XLX, has intrigued me lately. We can query the computer about it this afternoon if you would care to do so. That sounds perfect. Of course, it would be perfect, thought Cidra. Most things were perfect in Clementia. For the first time she understood one of the reasons why she had never really felt at home here. Great quantities of perfection and serenity could be a little boring. Severance paused inside the gates of Clementia and gazed at the vista of gardens and beautifully proportioned architecture. Here there were no ugly or jarring structures that had been hastily erected or incompletely thought out prior to construction. Around him people garbed in simple, elegant robes nodded politely as they passed him on the wide stone paths that wound through the gardens. There was no shushing sound of a passing runner or sled. As far as Severance could see, there were no vehicles at all. Behind the small, walled city rose the majestic coastal mountains. In front of the gates stretched a quiet, sheltered bay that rarely knew the turbulence of sea storms. Jude would have been at peace here. Severance took a deep, steadying breath and reminded himself that while this would have been the ideal environment for his brother, it was not for Cidra. He made his way toward the archives, a structure that had been pointed out for him by the wolf who guarded the gate. You can't miss it. Big domed building in the center of the campus. The wolf had regarded Severance quizzically. You here to attend classes? No, Severance had answered. I'm here to find someone. Who? Cidra Rainforest. She works in the archives. He had waited impatiently while the wolf had contacted Cidra's home. I talked to her mother. Seems Otana Rainforest is expecting you. The guard had waved him through the gates. There were other non-harmonics in the vicinity, probably students who attended the university, but the majority of the people wore the formal gowns and serene expressions of true harmonics. Among them Severance felt large, awkward, and out of place. Rather like a Torla in a garden. Not for the first time that day doubts rose to undermine his determination. Cidra wasn't a Torla in this garden. With her grace and poise she could blend in beautifully. But the weeks of gathering uncertainty had done their work well. He had to find her and take her with him. She might be able to mingle with harmonics, but under the surface she was his passionate, loving woman, and if she had forgotten that in the time she had been back in Clementia, he would remind her. He needed her with him. Severance found the archives without further instructions. The curved structure seemed to rest almost unsupported on the ground, its diazite walls protecting the array of computers, study areas, and treasured bound volumes within. The bits and pieces of knowledge that had survived the crash of the colony ship had formed the heart of Clementia's archives. In the intervening years, a great deal of new information had been added. It was the center of learning for the Stanza 9 system. Only when he was inside the building did Severance realize just how large it was. He would need help in locating Cidra. Try history. She works with First Family files a lot, an attendant at the front desk told him. Straight ahead and to your left. Severance followed the directions to a room that had been designated as the repository of First Family diaries and written records. He saw Cidra almost at once. She was wearing a morning robe, her neat head bent attentively toward a computer screen. She didn't notice him. For a long moment Severance simply stood staring at her, waiting for the sudden, aching surge of hunger to fade back to more manageable proportions. Sweet harmony, but he had missed her. What in a renegade's hell was he going to do if she hadn't missed him? she looked up at that moment and saw him, Severance. Then she was on her feet, flying toward him with a lover's welcome in her eyes. He caught her up fiercely and swung her around as she threw herself into his arms. The exhilaration washing over him was almost shattering in its intensity. He realized he was shaking. "I've come to steal you out of paradise. It's about time you got here." "I know." He captured her face between his hands and kissed her. "I know." It was a long time later before Severance had Cidra to himself. Her parents had been gracious and hospitable, accepting him immediately. He had been grateful for that. One niggling concern he'd had to face on the long trip back to Lovelady was the issue of how he would deal with a set of harmonic in-laws. But with harmonic civility, Talina and Gam had taken all obstacles out of his path. They were content with their daughter's decision. And with Gam, at least, Severance had found some common ground. He had spent 2 hours going over the investment program Cidra's father had mapped out. After dinner, during which Severance had worried excessively about his table manners, Cidra had invited him out into the gardens. He had welcomed the escape, pulling her into his arms beneath the shelter of a flowering tree. In the moonlight her eyes were luminous. Severance knew that he could get lost in them. "I was afraid from time to time during the past few weeks, but deep inside I think I knew you'd be waiting," he said. "I know. I had a few anxious moments myself. But somehow I knew you'd come for me." She leaned her head on his shoulder and smiled. "We belong together. When are we leaving?" "As soon as possible. But there are 1 or 2 things we have to take care of first." She lifted her head and wrapped her arms around his neck. "Such as?" "Such as getting married." He brushed a stray strand of her hair behind her ear. "I love you, Cidra. I want this done right. I want the bonds in place for life." "I love you, Severance." "I know." He smiled. "I saw it in your eyes today when you came running into my arms. It must have been in my eyes when you put me on the freighter back to Lovelady, because I knew I loved you then too." "I couldn't see things as clearly then," he admitted, "and now you can?" "You're sure of your decision, Severance?" "I couldn't bear it if you changed your mind." "Cidra, it was never my own mind I was unsure of. I only wanted the time so that you could be certain of what you were doing. We could argue about who didn't trust whom all evening, but it doesn't matter any longer. You're here now, and I'm going with you." "Yes." He stroked his hands down to her hips and smiled slightly. "Absolutely. Sometimes we wolves sort of blunder along until we get things right, but when we finally do get them right, we stick to them. I'll never let you go, Cidra." Her mouth curved teasingly as her eyes mirrored her love. "Wait until you hear my marriage terms before you make any rash promises." "I'm listening," he drawled. "I should warn you that by leaving me alone for the past few weeks you've given me plenty of time to work out these terms. Obviously a mistake on my part." "Yes, well, first, I am no longer satisfied to sign on as a mere member of Severance Pay's crew. I am demanding full partnership status." "Ah." She nodded vigorously. "Ah, indeed. Next I must insist on a full high ritual wedding ceremony." He groaned. "Why?" "For luck. We can skip the 2 hours of telepathic meditation in the middle of the ceremony if you like. Given the fact that the bride and groom can't communicate telepathically and would be bored to their toes, I think that would be wise," he agreed, "and last but not least, I want some more opportunities to learn the fine points of free market without having to wager every fire barrel hair comb or emerald floss slipper I happen to own. And don't even think of suggesting I bet genuine credit. It's all invested along with yours. You know the game's no fun unless the stakes make it worthwhile. Until I get to the point where I've got half a chance of winning occasionally, we're going to have to settle for wagers that won't bankrupt me." Severance pulled her close. "I'm sure," he said, his mouth hovering just above hers, "that we can find something for you to bet that has nothing to do with credit or fire barrel combs. Don't worry. I'll think of something." You're so resourceful. Good with my hands too. Does this mean, Cidra asked as she lifted her face for his kiss, that you're accepting my marriage terms? He grinned in the moonlight, all male and all wolf. Your terms are nothing compared to mine. Wait until you hear them. I intend to go over them in great detail with you. It's all right, she assured him. Whatever they are, I accept. Just like that? Of course. I trust you, Severance. His silent laughter faded to reveal the intensity of the love in his eyes. And I trust you, sweet Cidra, to the ends of the universe. He sealed the vow with a kiss,